Every night, at the same hour, the entire Blackwood family, all 9 of them, walked out to their well. They weren't drawing water up. They were lowering something down. For 2 years, this ritual coincided with 7 disappearances and dozens of missing livestock from the Arkansas hills. In the winter of 1861, the county finally intervened. Men arrived with shovels and lime, tasked with filling the well permanently. What they poured took 3 full days, ending with a chilling decree in the county record. The Blackwood well was not to be reopened. Not for drought, not for law, not by anyone ever. This was something else entirely, a dark secret buried deep. This is the story of what lived at the bottom of the Blackwood well, and why the men who buried it went to their graves, refusing to say its name out loud. To understand what happened on that farm, you have to understand the land it sat on. The Blackwoods did not dig that well. When Josiah Blackwood brought his family up from Tennessee in the 1840s, the well was already there, waiting at the very center of the property. The man who sold him the land mentioned it once in passing, and then never spoke of it again. It was lined with a pale, fitted stone that no one in the county could name. Not limestone, not sandstone, something smoother, older, cut into blocks, so precise you could not slide a knife blade between them. The shaft went down farther than any farm well had a right to go. A local mason who studied it in 1852, said the stonework was finer than anything being built in Arkansas at the time. He said it looked like the work of people who came long before and then refused to go near the thing ever again. That phrase, the people who came before, is going to matter more than you can imagine, because the Blackwood well was not the only strange structure on that land. There were low stone foundations out in the woods, half swallowed by soil, arranged in a shape that made no sense for a farm, perfect angles, a geometry that reached outward like the points of a star. The Blackwoods were farming on top of the bones of something much older. And at the dead center of it, all sat that well. And whatever had been patient enough to wait at the bottom of it, for the first few years, nothing happened. The family drew water like anyone else. The children played near the shaft. Life was hard, but ordinary. And then, in the autumn of 1859, the youngest Blackwood daughter, a girl of 6 named Ruth, leaned too far over the edge while drawing a bucket, and she fell straight in. They heard her hit the water far below. Josiah threw down a rope, and here is where the story stops making any sense. Ruth did not scream. For one long, terrible minute, there was only silence from the shaft. Then the family heard her voice, calm and small, drifting up out of the dark. She said she was not alone down there. She said something was holding her up, keeping her head above the water. Something with hands that were cold and far too large to belong to a man. When they finally hauled her out, she was dry. Not damp, bone dry, as though she had never touched the water at all, and she was smiling. From that night forward, Ruth would not sleep inside the house. She wanted to be near the well. In the days that followed, Ruth stopped eating at the table. She carried her plate out to the shaft, lowered it on a string, and hummed into the dark until sunrise. The Blackwoods should have loaded the wagon and left that farm by morning. Instead, they stayed, and they began to listen to the things that Ruth told them. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Blackwood well, and everything the county sealed beneath it. The original depth measurements taken the week before it was filled. The ledger of livestock, and the exact dates each animal vanished. The county surveyor's sealed report naming every man who shoveled it shut. I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let us continue. What Ruth told them started small. She said the thing in the well was hungry, and that it had been hungry for a very long time. She said it was grateful. She said if the family fed it, it would keep them safe, keep the crops growing, keep the winters mild. At first, Josiah did what any frightened father might do. He humored the child. He lowered a bucket of kitchen scraps into the shaft to calm her. But the next morning the bucket came up empty and clean, scraped down to bare wood, and the family's failing corn had turned green overnight. Josiah told himself it was coincidence, a lucky rain he had not noticed, bad scraps that a fox had carried off. A man will tell himself almost anything to avoid the truth, sitting at the bottom of his own well. But every time he fed it, the farm answered back. A dying apple tree came back to fruit within a week. A sick cow rose up healthy the next morning. The land was making a trade, and the Blackwoods, poor, frightened, watching neighbors go under in the drought, decided it was a trade worth making. They just did not tell anyone. Not the church, not the neighbors, not each other. Not really. They simply walked out to the well after dark, when no one could see what they carried. There was a sound, too. On the nights they fed it. Not every night, but often enough that the family learned to expect it. Once the bucket reached the bottom and went still, there would come a low vibration, up through the rope, up through the stone, a deep rhythmic pulse that Josiah's wife said felt less like a noise than a heartbeat. Something enormous, breathing slow in the cold below their farm. And when it was satisfied, the pulse would fade, the string would go slack, and whatever they had lowered would simply be gone. So they fed it again and again. Scraps became table food. Table food became a whole slaughtered hog lowered down on a rope that came back frayed and dripping. The Blackwood farm, which had been dying like every other farm in that dry stretch of Arkansas, began to thrive in a way that made the neighbors talk. Full harvests in a drought year. Fat cattle when everyone else was losing stock. And every night at the same hour, 9 silhouettes walking out to the well with buckets. And Ruth always leading them. The neighbors noticed the Blackwood luck long before they understood it. In a year when half the county was selling off land and burying children who had gone hungry, the Blackwood table was full. Their smokehouse hung heavy. Their well, everyone assumed, must have struck some deep spring. Men came asking to dig wells of their own along the same line. And Josiah always found a quiet reason to send them away. Because the truth was that the Blackwood well gave nothing. It only took, and what it gave back, it pulled out of the land around it, out of the crops and cattle, and before long, out of the living. But a thing that eats never stops being hungry. It only grows. By the spring of 1860, the scraps and the hogs were not enough. Ruth came to the family with new instructions, and her voice, the neighbors would later say, no longer sounded entirely like a child's. The thing wanted live animals now. It wanted them lowered down breathing. So, the Blackwoods began buying livestock from farms across the county, more than any single family could ever use, and none of those animals were ever seen again. This is when the disappearances start showing up in the county record. First, it was goats and calves. Then, it was a neighbor's prize horse. The county did not connect it at first. Livestock wandered off. Thieves worked the back roads. But the animals that vanished all vanished in the same direction, toward the same farm, and men who tracked their missing stock to the edge of the Blackwood property always turned back at the tree line, saying the air out there felt wrong, heavy, like the moment before a storm that never came. One farmer swore he heard his own stolen mule braying from somewhere underground, far below the field, and then the braying stopped all at once, as if a door had closed on it. Then, in the summer of 1860, it was a person. His name was Eli Combs, a drifter who did odd jobs on farms for meals and a place to sleep. He took work at the Blackwood place in July and was never seen leaving it. When his cousin came asking, Josiah Blackwood said the man had moved on toward Missouri. But Eli Combs had left his boots, his coat, and his only knife behind in the Blackwood barn. No man walks to Missouri in July without his boots. The thing in the well had tasted something new, and Ruth said it would not go back. And the thing was not the only one who had changed. Ruth had changed, too. She had grown quiet in a way that frightened her own mother. And she knew things she had no way of knowing. She knew when a neighbor was coming up the road before the dog did. She knew which of the cattle would be chosen next. And once, when her brother asked what was really down there, Ruth turned to him with that too old look on her face and said only that it was very old, that it had been sleeping for longer than there had been people, and that it remembered a world no one else alive had ever seen. Before we move on to the winter, everything changed. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the feedings is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county records. The feeding schedule, the names on the ledger. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. After Eli Combs, the Blackwoods changed. Neighbors who visited that autumn described a family that had gone hollow. The parents rarely spoke. The older children moved through their chores like sleepwalkers. Only Ruth seemed fully awake, and she was always watching the well, always at the edge of it, sometimes leaning down and speaking into the dark in a low voice, in words that were not English and not any language the neighbors recognized. A traveling preacher named Amos Wright came through in October, heard the rumors, and announced he would go pray over the Blackwood farm and drive out whatever had taken root there. He rode out one clear morning. His horse came back alone that evening. Amos Wright was never found. 7 people vanished around that farm in total, and every single one of them had gone looking for answers about the well. By the winter of 1861, the fear in Baxter County had turned into something the men could no longer ignore. A local farmer named Silas Hardin, who had lost his own brother to that stretch of hills, gathered a group of men and rode out to confront Josiah Blackwood. What they found on that farm broke something in all of them. The livestock pens were empty and stained dark. The house was cold and silent, and out at the well, they found the entire Blackwood family kneeling in a circle around the shaft in the freezing air, holding hands, swaying, and singing down into it in that language no one knew. In the center of the circle stood Ruth, no longer smiling, staring at the men with eyes that Silas Hardin later described as being far too old for a 9-year-old girl. Silas Hardin had known the Blackwoods for 15 years. He had eaten at their table. He had watched these children grow. And now, he stood in a frozen field, looking at a family that had been hollowed out from the inside, kneeling in worship over a hole in the ground. And he understood, in a way he could never fully explain, that whatever had come up out of that well had not just been eating their livestock, it had been eating them, their warmth, their fear, whatever it is inside a person that makes them a person. And it had saved Ruth for last, because Ruth was the one who had let it in. The men tried to pull the family back from the edge, and that is when they heard it. A sound came up out of the well, not a voice, not water, a slow, wet, dragging sound, like something enormous shifting its weight, far below, followed by a smell so foul that 2 of the men were sick on the spot. Silas Hardin looked down into that shaft with a lantern, and for the rest of his life he refused to describe what the light fell on. He would only say that the bottom of the well was much farther down than water should have been, that the pale stone kept going and going, and that something down there in the dark had opened, and it was looking back up at him. One of the younger men, a boy of 17 named Caleb, dropped his lantern and ran until he reached the county road. He would not go back out to that farm for the rest of his life. Years later, as an old man, he told his grandchildren only one thing about that night. He said, the well did not echo. You can drop a stone down a normal well and hear it strike the water. But when Silas Hardin's lantern light fell into the Blackwood shaft, the darkness swallowed it whole and gave nothing back. No bottom, no water, no floor. Just a throat of pale stone going down into somewhere that should not exist under an Arkansas farm. They did not argue after that. They took the Blackwood family by force, loaded them onto wagons, and rode for town. And the very next day, the county issued the order: fill the well. Every man who could carry a shovel came out to the Blackwood farm, and for 3 days they poured earth and lime and broken stone down into that shaft. And for 3 days the ground beneath their feet trembled. The dragging sound continued the entire time, growing more frantic as the hole closed. And that near the end, just before the last of the slight disappeared, something down there began to pound against the fitted stone from the inside. They filled it anyway. Some of the men could not sleep for weeks afterward. They said the pounding got into their bones. A slow and deliberate knocking from beneath the earth, always in threes, as though something patient were testing the seal, the way a prisoner learns every stone of a cell. And a few of them, the ones who stayed until the very last shovelful, swore that the last sound to come up out of that shaft before the pale slab dropped was not a growl and not a roar. It was a voice, a child's voice, and it was laughing. They sealed the top with a slab of that same pale ancient rock, and the county clerk wrote his single line: the Blackwood well was not to be reopened, ever. Now, here is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it is the part that turns a local horror into something much larger. Because that pale, fitted stones, the perfect angles in the woods, the star-shaped foundations the Blackwoods farmed on top of, none of that belonged to the 1840s, and none of it belonged to any settler. Researchers who look into the buried history of that land point to the same uncomfortable pattern that shows up all across the old world. Structures too advanced for the people said to have built them. Foundations half sunk into the earth as if a great flood of mud had risen up and swallowed the first floor of the world. Perfect fortress geometry, appearing in the middle of nowhere. Credited to no one. Explained by no one. The theory is that the Blackwood well was never a well at all. It was a shaft, a door, something the people who came before had built to seal a thing away, and then buried under an entire era of forgotten history so that no one would ever open it again. Look at the pattern, and it stops being a single ghost story. Across this continent and the old world beyond, the same fingerprints appear. Fortress walls in the shape of perfect stars standing in wilderness where no army ever marched. Buildings whose ground floors sit beneath 10 feet of soil, as though an ocean of mud rose up in one season, and no one wrote it down. Whole cities credited to pioneers, who supposedly raised them by hand out of stone. They had no tools to cut. The official history says settlers. The evidence in the ground says something came before. Something advanced, something erased on purpose. And whoever erased it may have had very good reasons for the things they chose to bury. And the Blackwoods, without ever knowing it, had bought the land, found the door, and pried it back open one bucket at a time. The reset that erased the old world did not just bury cities and rewrite maps. According to this theory, it buried the reasons certain places were sealed in the first place. It buried the warnings. It left families like the Blackwoods sitting on top of things they had no memory of and no way to understand. until a 6-year-old girl leaned too far over the edge and something cold reached up to catch her. Think about what that means for the Blackwoods. They were not evil people. They were not cultists who went hunting for a monster. They were a poor family from Tennessee who bought a cheap piece of land, drew water from the well that came with it, and had no idea they had moved their children onto the roof of a prison. There was no warning they could read, no record left in a language they knew. The generation that sealed the thing away had been wiped so completely from memory that their descendants inherited the danger without the fear. That is the real horror underneath the Blackwood legend, not the thing in the well. The forgetting that walked a whole family straight to it. What happened to the Blackwoods afterward only deepens it. The parents and older children were dead within a year. Of fever, of grief, of causes the records list vaguely and never explain. All of them except Ruth. Ruth Blackwood simply disappeared from every record that winter. No death listed, no burial, no trace. A 9-year-old girl who had spent 2 years speaking into the dark and then was gone, as though the land had quietly taken her back. The Blackwood farm was never resettled. The fields grew over it. The house fell in, but the well is still there, out in those Arkansas hills, sealed with pale stone, exactly where the county left it. And to this day, no one has ever reopened it. Some say that is superstition. Some say it is respect for the dead. And some say it is because everyone who has ever gone looking for the Blackwood well has found the sealed slab exactly where the record says it should be, and has felt, standing over it, the unmistakable sense that something on the other side is still patient, still hungry, and still waiting to be fed. If this story pulled you in, you need to see what happened. 3 counties, over on land with the same pale stone foundations, where an entire settlement went silent in a single night in 1873. It is one of the darkest cases in the region, and it connects to the Blackwood well in a way you will not expect. That video is on your screen right now. Watch it next.